Okay, welcome back. This is our last lecture for Unit 2. This is our lecture on the art impulse, in this case the art impulse of narrative. The very first art impulse, if you remember, we talked about how people make art. One of the most important reasons why people make art is to just make it and to say, I was here, that I did something and I made a mark in the world. But probably another really fundamental impulse in art is the desire to tell stories. And then we see narrative art going all the way back to Paleolithic cave painting art. We see narrative art in the entire history of art. Over and over again, people are telling stories with the images, the artwork, sculptural and two-dimensional artwork that they're making. So, first point I want to make is that a lot of this that we see, a lot of the narrative art that we see throughout the whole history of art that we're going to be looking at, a lot of it is political, because for large portions of the cultures and of the times that we look at, artists are employees of the state, of the powers that be, and that those powers that be have very important stories that they need to tell or want to tell to their subjects. Oftentimes those powers that be are both political power and religious power, like in the case of the Emperor Ashurbanipal, who is the emperor of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He's trying to tell a story here about the fact that he is really one mean, bad, tough dude, that he's scary, and that no one should mess with him. So at his palace, he built, he had these sculptures made on all the walls going all around the main rooms of his palace and the main hallway that led to the throne room. And there were only really two main stories that he told in those. One is that Ashurbanipal defeats all of his enemies, and two is that Ashurbanipal hunts lions. In Assyrian culture, as well as many other Mesopotamian cultures, hunting lions is considered an act only worthy of a great king. And in this case, you can see not only is he worthy of it, he's literally killing this lion while grabbing it by the throat. So he's saying, don't mess with me. And sometimes those political messages are counter to the culture, or like not supporting the powers that be, but rather a critique of the powers that be. We talked a little bit about Jericho's painting The Raft of the Medusa, and it is an important painting on a number of ways, but one of the things to remember is that it's a critique of the French government and of their colonization and slave labor policies. It's about a shipwreck, and so Jericho is basically saying that it was the fault of the French people, the French government, and the French industries that led to this disaster. And similarly, this painting by Pablo Picasso, Guernica, which we will also talk a lot more about in the future. Guernica is a protest painting, protesting war in this particular case. So a lot of narrative art, and remember we got into talking about narrative because of the fact that we were looking at Greek ceramics, especially black figure and red figure ceramics. And one of the things I pointed out is that during the Orientalizing period, the Greeks were put imagery on it, but it wasn't particularly telling a story. It was like animal forms, repeating animal forms. But when they went to black figure and red figure, they returned to their old tradition of putting narrative stories, mythological stories, on their ceramics. And so in this case, so they're telling the most important stories there are to them. These are both stories that tell who they are as a people, right, as well as stories that have moral lessons and religious lessons. If you don't know, so the story on this one is Achilles and Ajax. This is right before the final battle for Troy, and Achilles and Ajax are rolling die. They're gambling, and this story is the story of Hercules stealing the tripod from, I can't remember which priestesses he was stealing it from, but it's one of the travails of Hercules. Hercules' life was full of trouble. So as I hinted at when we were talking about mythology, another major reason why people put stories in artwork is for religious purposes, to tell religious stories and to have stories that give religious moral lessons. There are two main types here. The first type, the one on the right, is literally just kind of is a story of religious heroism, right? This comes from the Old Testament. This is Judith and her maidservant, and so she is she pretends to she tricks Holofernes, who is the leader of a rival group from the Hebrews, and then secretly at night she chops his head off to defeat the enemy. And so she's you know, being heroic and saving her people. Whereas this painting, St. Francis in Ecstasy, is somewhat of a narrative, but it's a different type of narrative. It's a narrative about religious experience rather than a narrative about someone doing a religiously moral deed, right? It's a story of heroism. This is a story of a saint epitomizing religious holiness, right? That he is in the moment of being transfixed. He is receiving the presence of God. So one of the points I want to make is that some of the best, most compelling narrative art in the world is stuff that you've seen your whole life. Anyone who's looked at a picture book or any kind of illustration, you've seen illustrators illustrating stories in books probably most of your life. And there is since the since about 1860s, we've had this long tradition, especially in Western Europe and in America, of artists making illustrations. I chose these two examples because I think they're particularly nice. I like this Elizabeth Shippen Green piece a lot, and I love the fact that it's an illustration that leads into a book of stories about stories. It's a book of a collection of stories, but it is the very first image is about the idea of telling stories. And I love this illustration by N.C. Wyeth, which is just a really intense scene. You're wondering what's going to happen next. Okay, that is the end of part 1. I'll get to part 2.